All right. Mike's not here, but this is Drew, and this is Mike and Drew at Mountain View. And today we have a special guest because Mike's not here. This is Clint Burnett.
Hello, how are you?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's a beautiful day here, a beautiful view.
It's actually a little cold. It's not a beautiful day. I did not enjoy it today.
Really? I love the cold.
The drive was nice, though.
Drive was nice. The mountains are so beautiful. I love coming in and seeing them. It makes me always want to move out here every time I come out this way.
We're kind of in the middle of nowhere.
I know. I'd love to be in the middle of nowhere.
It's nice.
Yeah.
So what do? You have 17 jobs?
Yeah, maybe 18. Originally, I trained to be a historian of early Christianity. So I got a PhD in New Testament from Boston College with a minor in Old Testament. And that's become my passion because I don't do that full time. I teach part time at Johnson when I can, write and publish. I'm in the process of editing. I got my first round of edits for my third book, which is exciting. That'll be published by Erdman's 2024. I think that's when they think the book will be out. And so I do that. I'm also a part-time priest at my local Anglican church called Old North Abbey in Knoxville, Tennessee. And then full-time, I basically am an advisor on the financial side of things, mainly working with pastors and churches and nonprofits, encouraging them to be good stewards of what God's blessed them with.
That's so crazy. Any one of those things would be a full-time job, and you do all of them.
Oh, I don't get much sleep.
I'm sure. So, today we're going to talk about Philippians, the book of Philippians.
Okay.
Because that's your area of expertise.
It is.
And so we had the question come in. It was actually my wife's idea. The context of, I believe it's Philippians 4:13.
Mm-hmm.
I can do all things through him who strengthens me.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one that's very often taken out of context.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have a story. My middle school and high school math teacher would put this verse at the top of all of our math tests. Mrs. Morrison, if you're listening, I love you. I appreciate all you've done, but that was definitely taken out of context. So what can you give for us that kind of grounds that a little more? Because obviously you can't do all things. So what does that really mean?
Sure, yeah. So first and foremost, this is in a section of Philippians. It's almost like a thank you note to the Philippians who have sent aid to Paul time and time again. And so he's in prison as he is writing. I don't know exactly where. Some people hypothesize Rome. Some people more recently hypothesize an Ephesian imprisonment that Luke does not record in Acts. I tend to fall towards that latter camp, just making things feasible, the number of trips back and forth that the letter presupposes. And so this is sort of a thank you note that Paul sort of writes at the end of the letter, because most people don't understand that prison in antiquity was not meant as a rehabilitation place. So It's not a place that you went to be rehabilitated. It's a place you went before you went to trial, and then you usually fined, or you were usually sentenced to death or sent to a mine or something like that. So it's not a place of punishment. And so you are responsible for basically feeding yourself and everything associated with it. So you have to keep yourself up. The government doesn't do that for you in the first century. And so the Philippians have sent aid to Paul wherever he is imprisoned. And so at this section of the letter where that verse that's taken out of context so often appears is in the middle of a thank you note that Paul is talking about his experience as a prisoner, where he is basically at the whims of other people to support him at that point in time, because he cannot work with his hands as a tent maker to generate any income. So he needs some people to help him. And so basically verses 10 through 20 it's just a thank you note. And so with that in mind, he's basically writing, the main thrust is to talk about how the fact that it doesn't matter what situation he finds himself in, that he is grateful and he can tackle whatever situation that he's there, whether that be specifically in the context of this particular part, being in verse 12, he knows how to be humbled, he knows how to abound, he's been initiated into all things. And that word initiate that Paul uses in verse 12 is a technical term for initiation into what we call mystery cults in the first century. And it was this special arcane knowledge that you received and you're initiated into this God's cult. And so Paul sort of uses that term to say, similarly, any situation that I can face, I've been initiated into that situation. And the reason I have is because it keeps everything into perspective, that everything is all about the gospel and everything is all about living life for the glory of the triune God. And so that's sort of where this verse appears in the midst of this discussion about him being fed and being hungry and abounding, that I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, or through him who strengthens me, actually. So he's not talking about the fact that he can win a football game.
Right.
Yeah, he's not talking about the fact that he can, score a really high grade on a math test. What he's talking about is the fact that regardless of whatever situation, whether that is freedom or whether that's in prison, whether that's being fed or not being fed. And he's very hyperbolic at the same time. Paul loves to be hyperbolic, but it's basically that whatever situation he has, he can get through it because he keeps everything into perspective with God on his side.
And, walking into a situation where knowing that God has walked before you and he knows what you're about to go through and knows that you're going to be okay on the other end, or maybe not, but that is his will, That's so good. And I didn't even think about it that way. I mean, I knew it was more like that, but in the context of him being in prison and having to go hungry sometimes, that's so good.
Oh, yeah. He talks about, I know how to hunger, I know how to abound. He's experienced all that before, and so it doesn't matter. He's in prison for the gospel and for God's glory, and that's the only thing that really matters.
I think about that passage that Paul writes. I don't remember where it is, but where he talks about how, he's been through all these different things. He's been naked. He's been hungry. He's been, what is that verse?
2 Corinthians chapter 11, I think it is off the top of my head, maybe 12.
I need to study the Bible more. Yeah, it's just that Paul's been through all these different things. He's lived such a difficult life, and yet, God prepared him for the difficult life. He was a scholar of the Old Testament before he was a Christian, and that brings so much wisdom into his situation, and that he knew God in a way before he knew Jesus, but then Jesus kind of completed the picture for him. Yeah. All right, where else should we go with this? What else do you have?
Well, it's also important that Paul says this in verse 13, but he also says it as the preface for his discussion of the thank you for the gift that he's received from the Philippians. So he sort of prefaces this, wants to make sure that they know he doesn't really need the gift that they gave him.
Okay, yeah.
Because beginning in verse 14, he talks about how they became a co-partner with him in his tribulation. And this tribulation is the very specific tribulation of being in chains, and that they sent to him time and time again, basically, to partner with him in giving of money so that they could support his mission work, specifically in Thessalonica and in Macedonia and other places. So he just wants to make sure that Paul seems to have, rightly so, because we all know, being in churches, that we need money to function, we need money to operate, but we don't want money to become an idol.
Right.
And so there's always this kind of weird thing about money. You find the business meetings at churches are always kind of weird.
Yeah, I mean, we had a board meeting last night, and we talked a little bit about money, and it's like, how do we best, work with the money that we have? We have 3 separate accounts, and last night we actually decided to merge 2 of the accounts because we just don't really use this other account, so we're just going to have this other one eat it. And just how do we go about doing that well and stewarding our money well? Yeah, absolutely.
Have you ever spoken at a church and or done anything at a church, and they've come in, you got the guy that's got the check and he's trying to pay you, but he doesn't want anybody to see that he's paying you, so he kind of clandestinely kind of slips it in your hand.
At this church, I receive a physical paycheck every Sunday, so that actually happens every Sunday.
Yeah, because we have this weird thing about money. So Paul wants to make sure that the Philippians know it's not about the money, it's about the intent and the fact that they're partnering with him, which includes a financial component.
Yeah,
I mean, a huge one, because he needs to eat, and needs to live, but it's all for God's glory, and that's kind of where the rest of the passage goes from verse 14 and onward. So he wants to make sure that God is the one who gets the glory behind all of this, and even counts their gift to him as a sweet-smelling offering, acceptable sacrifice that's actually pleasing to God.
Yeah. I mean, I see there in verse 17, it says, not that I seek the gift, but I seek the profit that accumulates to your account. And then the first part of verse 18 there, I've been paid in full and have more than enough. I'm fully satisfied. So it just, he doesn't need the gift that they're giving, but he's so appreciative of it anyway. In that position, I certainly would be that way as well. I'd probably be a little more worried in his position, but
sure, I would be too. I probably wouldn't be writing a letter to a congregation that I founded. Concerned about what they're doing. I'd be more concerned about me and probably freaking out the fact that I'm in prison. So I think that in and of itself is a pretty amazing thing. But it's interesting that Paul keeps everything into perspective.
Yeah,
he always has a perspective of the end, sort of the telos, the goal of life. And sort of thinks about, if you want to think about it like this, he always has new creation in mind. New creation's always in front of him, like the fulfillment of everything God is doing through Christ and through the Spirit. And so that's kind of how he can keep money in perspective, that he can see the end. And so that's where he's headed, and the money helps get there because it helps spread the gospel and those types of things.
Right.
And so it's a really healthy perspective, focus really on the telos and the goal of existence and what the world's moving towards.
Yeah, I wonder if, actually, I know that that's something that churches need, We need to have a bigger perspective, looking at the timeline. I used to have my Spanish teacher in high school, actually, had this illustration that there'd be this long rope, and this is all of the timeline. And then she took a little highlighter and highlighted an inch of the rope, and that's your life on the rope, and just keeping that perspective in mind. And I just remember that was very powerful for me as a high schooler, thinking, this really doesn't matter. My test grade next week really doesn't matter. Whoever girl I was pursuing, that doesn't matter, because the world and the timeline of life is so much bigger than that. It's so much bigger than me. And I think that's how Paul can keep that selflessness. He's not focused on himself. He's focused on the people around him, the people who he has talked to in the past that he's concerned about and wants them to grow in the midst of what seems like crisis.
Oh, certainly. Like when you have the end in mind, then that helps you put everything into perspective. And that's one of the problems that I think our culture faces right now is everyone lives in the moment. Yeah. No one thinks about the future.
Yeah.
I saw a study the other day in the Wall Street Journal about how for the first time in a long time, parents think the future is going to be, they're more pessimistic about the future for their kids than they ever have been in the history of the 20th century. Most people think their kids are going to be better off for the first time. And I think that's in large part to the fact that we, as a culture, we live in the moment, here and now, what matters for us, what feels good. And that is so anti-Christian. And the gospel is so countercultural to that we have to have the goal in mind, whether that be as soon as we wake up in the morning, but everything is going towards that goal, even the Lord's Supper, even communion, right? You get the idea of you remember what's past, what's present, and you do this until the Lord comes. So you think about the future too. And so having that always before you, I think that's one of the things that guided Paul in all decisions that he made.
Yeah.
And I think if we could adopt that more as a church, and as a culture, we'd be a lot better off thinking about the future than just about how I get mine right now.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I've been guilty of we really need to. I really need to be present in the moment, and absolutely, there's value to that. But being present in the moment while keeping in mind what is to come, that's so interesting, and that's so interesting about the fact that parents are more pessimistic than ever. A disillusionment of culture. And I mean, we see it all around us. There's all these things. I mean, there was a mass shooting on Monday. Yeah. That's so nuts that these things around us are happening. And it's so easy to get discouraged. And I mean, I was discouraged. I was like, oh man, what do you do from that? Where do you go from there? But keeping the end in mind and keeping in mind that Jesus has gone before us and therefore you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you.
Right. Yeah. The victory's already been won. We're just sort of, I like the V-Day, D-Day analogy. I forgot what New Testament scholar was the first one. He was a French guy. His name slips my mind. But it'll come to me at a later time. But he has this really, it's been helpful for me to think about as far as, essentially when D-Day happened and when the Allies in World War II invaded France and invaded the Nazi-occupied territory. At that point, the battle was over, but we still had to get to V-Day. They had to make it all the way to Berlin. And so for us, he sort of compares the Christian life to that. The victory's already been won. We're just waiting for the consummation of that victory to happen. We're waiting for V-Day to take place, but our D-Day is already happened. The victory is secure. Now we're just kind of waiting there, and that's the two poles that we live between, this D-Day and this V-Day. And
it's hard work to get through that.
Yeah, it's super hard work. But funneling everything through V-Day, I mean, you get to see what really matters. And so to me, it helps me actually live. I think it helps one live in the present better, because you can see what really matters at the end is going to be, did I love God with all my heart, soul, strength, and mind? Did I love my neighbor as myself? What did I do to help spread the gospel and participate in God's kingdom in the here and now? It's not what kind of car did I drive. It's not where did I live or what my house look like or where did my kids go to school, where they get into college, all those things like that. That is really immaterial at the end of the day. It just doesn't matter.
Yeah. And then you go back to this war imagery. A soldier on D-Day is not worried about what his hair looks like or even what's for dinner that night.
Right.
He is focused on pushing forward. Yeah, that's such good imagery. I'm going to use that. That's going to be a sermon illustration.
Well, I mean, battle imagery is all throughout Paul's epistles. That or an athletic contest, a race, which was super huge in the first century. It's when everybody went. It was the SEC football, if you wish, or the March Madness, if you want to think about it, of the first century. Everyone loved going to games. They loved seeing these competitions. And so, I mean, Paul always talks about the Christian life, not always, but frequently makes allusions to the Christian life being a battle and the Christian life being a sign of a kind of race, or you're an athlete in a competition.
Because both of those things require hard work. One of my first sermons ever, I preached about me being a football player and how that was a complete life change from sitting on the couch playing video games. I changed how I ate. I changed what I did in my free time. I changed, all these different things so that I could be the best football player I could. And I was not a good football player, but it was fun. But putting in the work every single day, because it is a battle every single day and it is a competition every single day. Work to push forward, pressing on toward the goal. Well, we're coming up on time. Do you have a last idea that we want to end with?
I hope people read Philippians 4:13 differently now. I hope people understand the context and are able to then translate it into our modern context, maybe a little more faithfully to what Paul intended than just, I want to make an A on a math test, or I'm going to be able to get this job promotion, or all these things that really don't matter at the end of the day.
Or get all this money or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. Well, this has been not Mike, but Drew at Mountain View. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions, you can email us at podcast@MVCC, the number 6mile.org. And that's really all we got. Eat your vegetables.